Hello, and welcome to my final project for political science. The theme for this project is civil rights and their relation to modern-day issues. To start off, we will review the First Amendment rights. The First Amendment guarantees and protects 5 basic freedoms: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom to petition the government. These freedoms are pretty self-explanatory, but let's just review. Freedom of religion allowed that you may practice any religion freely so long as its practice does not violate any other laws. Freedom of speech allows that you are free to express any opinion without consequence or jail time. However, this excludes serious verbal threats. Freedom of press is essentially the same as freedom of speech, but false or defamatory statements aren't protected. Freedom of assembly protects the people's ability to gather peacefully. And finally, the freedom to petition, which means you can sign a petition or file a suit against the government. While these seem simple enough, they are not always used in predictable ways, and the 2 civil rights we will be discussing most today is the freedom of speech and the right to assembly, considering that these are some of the most talked about issues in the past couple of weeks. The following are 2 protests, and they are both considered peaceful. I would like you to listen to the following protest descriptions and identify what right they are fighting for. First, we will start with the shelter-in-place protest. In case you haven't heard or read about the recent protest, here's the basics of their message. These protesters feel that their rights have been violated by the states extending the stay-at-home order. The protests were organized by primarily conservative groups claiming the government had no right to tell them what to do with their body and to allow them to continue working. And a small few believe the virus itself is a hoax and is fighting the government's agenda. This particular protest at the Michigan State Capitol was filled with protesters open carrying weapons and not wearing protective face masks. The group of armed protesters made headlines for charging the doors of the Capitol to protest the state orders. Similar forces are currently sending the Governor Whitmer death threats. No shots were fired and no arrests were made save for 2 protesters who fought with one another, and no tickets were written for those who were not wearing masks. Similar protests are popping up all over the country, as well as in other countries. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Mauna Kea protests. These protests have been going on since the construction began on their mountain in the 1960s, but it didn't reach its peak until the most recent plans were released to build the TMT, or 30-meter telescope. Other telescopes have been built before, one of the larger ones dubbed Keck. This new project would be significantly larger. This massive project was fought by the native Hawaiian people for the sake of protecting the rest of their sacred lands, and they did so peacefully by blocking the highway that led to the construction site. The leaders of the group ensured that no illegal activity was taking place at the protest, and those who were caught participating in smoking or drinking were asked to leave. After the project was approved, the prayer altars were removed. On June 24, 2015, 750 peaceful protesters halted construction and 12 people were arrested. This is of course not the first protest, largest protest, or the end of the fight, and it continues today to protect sacred land and practices. There has been a pause on protests because of the coronavirus, and the citizens were encouraged to stay home and stay safe. So what rights were fought for? Does the protest interfere with the safety of others? And does it interfere or restrict with the rights or freedoms of others? We can't cherry-pick who gets to take advantage of these rights. Look closely at who is being exempt and why. What are the intentions of the people who are protesting in any situation? Who are they hurting, if they are hurting anyone? And what scientific evidence backs their argument? Or what are they protecting? These laws are supposed to keep the people safe, and if protesters' messages or actions would put anyone else in danger or remove the rights of others, then they are violating these same laws. The civil rights of the people are often subject to inconsistent standards depending on the situation, and the people who are oftentimes more negatively affected by protests are people of color. This is reflected in the inconsistency in incarceration rates in the United States. Remember that these laws are not set in stone, and that their interpretation is what will matter most.